In the shadowed halls of Haverford Castle, a priceless 16th-century tapestry vanishes under cover of a raging storm, plunging the estate into a web of suspicion. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster whose quiet knitting hides a mind unravelling secrets. As a nervous curator, a trembling tour guide, a detached scholar, and a suave collector weave their alibis, Miss Marple's keen observations uncover crimson threads, hidden passages, and a trail of greed. With a cunning trap, she exposes the thief, a collector whose ambition betrayed him. Will the tapestry be restored, or are more secrets woven into Haverford's ancient walls? Dive into this tale of deception and discovery. Chapter 1. The Castle's Pride. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Devon, where Haverford Castle stood like a sentinel of a bygone era. Its grey stone towers, weathered by centuries, loomed over ancient oaks that whispered secrets in the breeze. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the castle's oak-panelled drawing-room, sipped her tea with the quiet contentment of one who appreciated both the elegance of her surroundings and the subtle undercurrents of human nature. Her friend, Lady Beatrice Haverford, a sprightly widow in her 60s with a penchant for dramatic gestures, waved a hand toward the open doorway leading to the great hall. "There it is, Jane," Lady Beatrice said, her voice rich with pride. "The Haverford Tapestry. Woven in 1572, they say, for some grand duke who hunted stags in these very woods. Isn't it splendid?" Her eyes sparkled as she gestured to the masterpiece hanging in the hall, its threads of crimson, gold, and emerald catching the fading light. The tapestry depicted a medieval hunt. Hounds bounding through a forest, a stag at bay, and knights in vibrant cloaks, their figures so lifelike they seemed to move. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and leaned forward, her keen eyes tracing the intricate stitches. "Quite remarkable," she murmured, her tone mild, but her mind alert. She noted the tapestry's size, nearly 12 feet across, and its position on the wall, secured by discreet fastenings that suggested careful maintenance. Her knitting needles, ever present, clicked softly in her lap, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. The drawing-room was not empty. 4 others shared the space, their presence noted by Miss Marple's unobtrusive gaze. Mr. Clarence, the castle's curator, stood near the fireplace, polishing his glasses with a handkerchief. A man of 50, with a pinched face and a meticulous air, he seemed to carry the weight of the castle's treasures on his narrow shoulders. Miss Evelyn, the young tour guide, hovered near the tea tray, her hands twisting nervously as she poured for the guests. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned, but her eyes darted about, as if expecting reproach. Dr. Harrow, a scholarly guest with a greying beard and a distracted manner, sat leafing through a book on the medieval art, occasionally muttering to himself. And then there was Mr. Vane, a collector of considerable wealth, whose tailored suit and polished demeanour could not mask the intensity with which he studied the tapestry across the hall. "Dinner will be at 7, Lady Beatrice announced, rising with a rustle of silk. "Jane, you must tell me more about St. Mary Mead. I'm sure it's full of charming scandals." She laughed, but Miss Marple only smiled, her attention lingering on the others. Mr. Vane's gaze had not left the tapestry, and she wondered at the hunger in his eyes. Mr. Clarence, replacing his glasses, cast a proprietary glance at the same treasure, as if it were his own. Miss Evelyn, clearing the tea things, nearly dropped a cup, her cheeks flushing. Dr. Harrow, oblivious, turned another page. As the group dispersed to dress for dinner, Miss Marple lingered, her needles pausing. She rose and approached the tapestry, her small bird-like figure dwarfed by its grandeur. Up close, she saw the delicate weave, the faint wear at the edges, and the faint scent of aged wool. "A thing of beauty," she said softly. But her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the glances, the gestures, the unspoken tensions of the room. People she knew were far more revealing than they intended. That evening, as the wind howled and a storm gathered over the hills, the castle seemed to brace itself. By morning, the Haverford tapestry would be gone, and Miss Marple's quiet observations would become the key to unravelling a mystery that lay hidden in the shadows of Haverford's ancient walls. Chapter 2. The Empty Frame. The storm that had battered Haverford Castle through the night left the morning air heavy with damp and the faint scent of wet stone. Dawn broke reluctantly, the sky a sullen grey, casting a pall over the ancient towers. Miss Jane Marple, roused early by the distant clamour of voices, dressed with her usual precision and made her way to the great hall. Her steps, light but purposeful, echoed faintly on the polished oak floors as she navigated the castle's labyrinthine corridors. The air was chilly, the storm's aftermath seeping through the stone walls, and she drew her shawl closer, her knitting bag tucked under one arm. The great hall was a scene of barely contained chaos when she arrived. Lady Beatrice Haverford stood before the vast empty frame where the tapestry had hung, her hands clasped tightly, her face drained of colour. The bare wall, with its faded outline of where the masterpiece had been, seemed an affront to the castle's dignity. "Stolen!" Lady Beatrice's voice trembled, a mix of disbelief and outrage. "My dear Jane, it's gone! The Haverford tapestry, gone! Who could have done such a thing?" Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, took in the room. With the quiet intensity of a hawk, the frame, a heavy oak structure, stood undisturbed, its brass fastenings loosened but intact, suggesting no brute force had been applied. The floor beneath bore no scratches, no telltale marks of a struggle. "A careful hand," she murmured, almost to herself, her fingers brushing the edge of her knitting bag, as if to anchor her thoughts. The hall's high windows admitted a weak light, illuminating the gathered faces, each a study in shock, suspicion, or studied neutrality. The castle's residents and guests had been summoned, and they stood in a loose semicircle, their expressions as varied as their motives might be. Mr. Clarence, the curator, hovered near the frame, his thin lips pressed into a line, his hands fidgeting with a pocket watch. Miss Evelyn, the young tour guide, stood slightly apart, her auburn hair escaping its pins, her eyes wide with something akin to fear. Dr. Harrow, the scholarly guest, adjusted his spectacles and clutched a notebook, his brow furrowed, as if the theft were a puzzle to be solved academically. Mr. Vane, the collector, leaned against a pillar, his polished exterior unruffled, but his eyes darting to the empty frame with a flicker of something unreadable. Inspector Grange, a burly man from the Devon Constabulary, arrived with a constable in tow, his heavy boots thudding on the floor. His face, weathered by years of dealing with petty crimes and the occasional grand larceny, was set in a scowl. "No one leaves this castle until we've got to the bottom of this," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of a man unused to contradiction. He surveyed the group, his gaze lingering on each suspect as if weighing their guilt. "This is no small matter. That tapestry's worth a king's ransom, and I'll have answers." Lady Beatrice, recovering her composure, gestured to Miss Marple. "Jane, you've a knack for seeing things others miss. Will you help us?" Her tone was pleading, but her eyes held a spark of trust in her old friend's quiet acumen. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene. "I shall do what I can, Beatrice," she said, her voice soft but firm. She settled into a high-backed chair near the hearth, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with a familiar click. To the untrained eye, she was merely an elderly spinster. But those who knew her understood that her mind was as sharp as the needles in her hands. Inspector Grange began his questioning, his notebook open, his pencil scratching as he recorded each response. Mr. Clarence was first, his voice clipped and precise. "I locked the Great Hall myself last night, as I always do," he insisted, his fingers tightening around his watch. "The key was in my possession until I retired. No one could have entered without breaking the door, and you see it's untouched." His eyes flicked to the frame, and Miss Marple noted a faint sheen of perspiration on his brow despite the morning's chill. Miss Evelyn, when called, stepped forward hesitantly, her hands twisting in her apron. "I was in the staff quarters all night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't hear anything, not with the storm so loud." Her gaze dropped to the floor, and Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in her fingers, the way she avoided looking at the empty frame. A nervous girl, perhaps, but was it guilt or merely fear of authority? Dr. Harrow, adjusting his spectacles, spoke with the detachment of a man more at home in a library than a crime scene. "I was in my room, reading," he said, producing a worn copy of The Art of the Renaissance, as if it were a talisman. "I heard the storm, of course, but nothing else. I retired early after dinner." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Miss Marple noticed his grip on the book, his knuckles white, as if anchoring himself against scrutiny. Mr. Vane, last to be questioned, offered a smile that was all charm and no warmth. "I slept through the storm, I'm afraid," he said, his voice smooth as polished mahogany. "I was in my room by 10, undisturbed until morning." His eyes met the inspector's with a confidence that bordered on defiance, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers brushed the cuff of his immaculate suit, a gesture of unease disguised as nonchalance. Inspector Grange grunted, clearly dissatisfied with the uniformity of their alibis. "No one heard anything, no one saw anything," he muttered, pacing before the empty frame. "Yet a tapestry the size of a barn door vanishes without a trace. Someone's lying." He turned to the constable. "Search the hall, top to bottom. Look for anything, tools, fibres, footprints." As the constable began his work, Miss Marple rose and approached the frame, her steps slow but deliberate. She examined the fastenings, noting their precision, the way they had been carefully undone rather than torn. "No haste here," she said softly, her fingers tracing the wood. The frame's lower edge was slightly scuffed, as if something heavy had brushed against it. But the floor beneath was pristine, swept clean by the diligent staff. She glanced at the high windows, their leaded panes secure, their latches undisturbed. The storm, she reasoned, would have masked any noise, but the thief had needed time and access, qualities not easily come by in a locked hall. She turned her attention to the suspects, who had dispersed slightly but remained under the inspector's watchful eye. Mr. Clarence was speaking in low tones to Lady Beatrice, his gestures animated, as if pleading his diligence. Miss Evelyn had retreated to a corner, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands still twisting. Dr. Harrow had opened his notebook, scribbling something with a frown, while Mr. Vane stood apart, his gaze lingering on the empty frame with an intensity that Miss Marple found curious. "Beatrice," Miss Marple said, approaching her friend, "who has access to the hall's keys?" Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. Lady Beatrice frowned, her fingers smoothing her skirt. "Mr. Clarence, of course, as curator. He oversees all the artifacts. The staff have a spare key for cleaning, but it's kept in the housekeeper's office. Evelyn might use it for tours, but she's never careless." Her voice faltered, as if the thought of betrayal among her trusted circle was too much to bear. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she resumed her seat. "And the guests? Do they wander freely at night?" "Oh, no," Lady Beatrice said. "The guest wings are separate, and the hall is locked after hours. Only the staff passages connect the wings to the main house, but they're narrow and rarely used." Her eyes widened. "You don't think someone crept through there, do you?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. She filed away the information, her mind turning to the layout of the castle. The servants' passages, she recalled from her tour, wound behind the great hall, their entrances discreet but accessible to those who knew the house well. A thief familiar with the castle's quirks could have used them, but who among the suspects had such knowledge? The constable returned, shaking his head. "Nothing, sir," he reported to Grange. "No tools, no fibres, no signs of a break-in. It's as if the thing vanished into thin air." Grange's scowl deepened. "It didn't walk off on its own," he snapped. "Someone took it, and they're in this room." He turned to the group, his voice rising. "I'll question each of you again, and I'll search every room if I must." "This isn't a game." Miss Marple, knitting quietly, observed the reactions. Mr. Clarence's face tightened, his hand clutching his watch, as if it were a lifeline. Miss Evelyn flinched, her eyes darting to the door. Dr. Harrow's pen paused, his expression unreadable. Mr. Vane's smile remained, but his eyes narrowed, a flicker of calculation passing through them. Guilt wears many masks, Miss Marple thought, her needles moving steadily, but it always leaves a trace. She rose again, her movements unhurried, and approached the hearth, where a faint warmth lingered from the previous night's fire. Kneeling with a care that belied her age, she examined the ashes, noting a small scrap of paper. Half burned, its edges curled. She retrieved it with a pair of tongs, careful not to draw attention, and slipped it into her pocket. Later, in the privacy of her room, she would find it bore a single word, valuation, in a precise hand that matched Mr. Clarence's. A clue, perhaps, but too fragile to act upon yet. As the morning wore on, the inspector organized a broader search of the castle grounds, though the storm's mud and wind had likely erased any external evidence. Miss Marple, declining to join the muddy trek, remained in the hall, her eyes roving over the suspects as they milled about, their conversation stilted. She noted Mr. Vane's polished shoes untouched by the night's rain, and wondered how a man could walk the corridors without a speck of mud. She observed Miss Evelyn's reluctance to meet Mr. Clarence's gaze, as if some unspoken tension lay between them. Dr. Harrow, meanwhile, had retreated to a window, his notebook open but his attention elsewhere, as if the theft were a minor distraction from his studies. Lady Beatrice, wringing her hands, approached Miss Marple. "Jane, what do you make of it? Could it be an outsider? A thief from the village, perhaps?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I think not, Beatrice. This was no random act. The tapestry is large, heavy, and delicate. Removing it required knowledge of the hall, the frame, and the castle's routines. No, the answer lies closer to home." Her voice was soft, but her eyes held a glint of certainty. As the inspector barked orders and the suspects dispersed to their rooms under strict instructions to remain available, Miss Marple settled back into her chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. The empty frame loomed like a challenge, its silence louder than the storm that had masked the theft. She thought of her village saint. Mary Mead, where secrets hid in plain sight, revealed by a glance, a gesture, a word out of place. Haverford Castle was grander, its stakes higher, but human nature, she knew, was the same everywhere. The tapestry was gone, but its absence told a story of its own. Miss Marple's mind, like her needles, worked steadily, weaving together the threads of motive, opportunity, and deception. The truth, she was certain, would emerge, as it always did, in the quiet spaces where others failed to look. Chapter 3. The Curator's Secret. The morning's chaos in the great hall had settled into an uneasy quiet by midday, as the Haverford Castle household dispersed under Inspector Granger's stern orders to remain within the grounds. The storm's aftermath left the air damp, and a faint mist clung to the castle's stone walls, lending an air of melancholy to the ancient estate. Miss Jane Marple, having excused herself from the inspector's search of the grounds, sat in the castle's library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound volumes and lit by tall windows that admitted a watery light. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to the distant murmur of voices from the hall, where the constable was still combing for clues. Miss Marple's attention, however, was fixed on Mr. Clarence, the curator, whose nervous demeanour had caught her eye from the moment the theft was discovered. He was a man of 52, with a lean frame, thinning hair, and a fastidiousness that bordered on obsession. His role as curator of Haverford's treasures gave him an air of authority, but this morning that authority seemed brittle, his hands trembling as he'd spoken to Inspector Grange. Now, as she watched him through the library's open door, he paced the corridor, pausing to adjust a portrait that hung ever so slightly askew. His movements were precise, but his eyes darted about, as if expecting accusation to leap from the shadows. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the needles in her hands, recalled a moment from the previous evening's dinner. Mr. Clarence had spoken at length about the tapestry's recent valuation, a process he'd overseen for Lady Beatrice. "The estate's finances are not what they once were," he'd said, his tone clipped, as if the admission pained him. "The tapestry's worth could secure Haverford for generations." His words had been met with polite nods, but Miss Marple had noted the way his gaze lingered on Lady Beatrice, a mix of loyalty and something less definable, resentment, perhaps, or desperation. She set her knitting aside and rose, her small figure moving with a quiet grace that belied her age. The library was a treasure trove of Haverford's history, its shelves heavy with ledgers, genealogies, and records of the estate's artifacts. She approached a table where Mr. Clarence had left a stack of papers, ostensibly part of his cataloguing work. With a glance to ensure she was unobserved, she leafed through them, her fingers deft and unobtrusive. Among the inventories was a document detailing the tapestry's valuation, £150,000, a staggering sum. A handwritten note in the margin, in Clarence's precise script, read, "Insurance to be adjusted." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Debts can weigh heavily, she thought, and a man like Mr. Clarence might see a way to lighten them. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Mr. Clarence entered the library, his face tightening as he saw her. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice striving for composure. "I didn't expect to find you here. Are you interested in our archives?" "Oh, very much," she replied, her tone mild, her eyes crinkling with a smile that disarmed suspicion. "Old houses like Haverford have such fascinating stories. The Tapestry, for instance. Its history must be a burden to maintain." She watched him closely, noting the faint flush that crept up his neck. "A burden, yes," he said, adjusting his glasses, "but a privilege. I've dedicated my life to preserving this estate's treasures." His words were earnest, but his hands betrayed him, fidgeting with a pen he'd picked up from the table. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm as she sat again. "It must be trying, with the estate's finances so strained. I heard you mention the valuation last night. A tempting sum, £150,000. Her voice was gentle, almost conversational, but her eyes missed nothing. Clarence stiffened, his pen pausing mid-air. "The valuation was routine," he said quickly. "Lady Beatrice requested it for insurance purposes, nothing more." He turned to the shelves, busying himself with a book, but Miss Marple noted the tremor in his fingers, the way he avoided her gaze. She changed tack, her tone light. "You must know every nook of this castle, Mr. Clarence. Those servants' passages, for instance, do they lead to the Great Hall?" Her question was innocent, but her eyes were sharp. Watching for his reaction. He hesitated, then nodded. "They do, but they're rarely used. Narrow, dusty things, meant for maids and footmen long ago. The staff prefer the main corridors." His voice was steady now, but Miss Marple sensed a guardedness, as if he were measuring his words. "Fascinating," she said, her needles clicking. "A thief might find them useful, though, to move unseen." She let the comment hang, observing the way Clarence's hand tightened on the book he held. He murmured something about checking the locks and excused himself, his departure hasty. Miss Marple remained in the library, her mind turning over the encounter. Clarence's devotion to Haverford was clear, but devotion could curdle into desperation under the weight of financial strain. The note about insurance suggested he'd considered the tapestry's value not just as a treasure, but as a solution. Yet his alibi, locking the hall and retiring, was solid, unless he'd lied about the key's whereabouts. She resolved to learn more about the castle's locks and who might have access to them. As she returned to her knitting, her thoughts drifted to the other suspects. Miss Evelyn's nervousness, Doctor. Harrow's detachment, Mr. Vane's calculated charm. Each offered a thread to follow. But Clarence's unease stood out, a knot in the pattern that demanded unravelling. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a churchwarden, burdened by debts, had misplaced a silver chalice, claiming it stolen to claim insurance. The man's guilt had shown in his hands and always fidgeting, just like Clarence's. She rose again, deciding to explore the servants' passages herself. Slipping into the corridor, she found a discreet door behind a tapestry. Not the stolen one, but a smaller piece depicting a pastoral scene. The passage beyond was narrow, its stone walls damp and cool, the air thick with the scent of age. Her small torch, retrieved from her bag, cast a beam along the uneven floor, revealing no obvious signs of recent passage. No footprints, no disturbed dust. But at a junction leading toward the great hall, she paused, her light catching a faint scuff on the wall, as if something large had brushed against it. She knelt, her joints protesting, and found a single crimson thread caught on a rough edge of stone. It matched the tapestry's hue, a silent witness to its journey. Tucking the thread into her handkerchief, Miss Marple retraced her steps, emerging into the main corridor just as Miss Evelyn passed by, carrying a tray of linens. The girl started, nearly dropping her load. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there," she said, her voice high with nerves. "Just exploring," Miss Marple said, her smile reassuring. "These old passages are so intriguing, don't you think? Do you use them often for your tours?" Evelyn shook her head quickly. "No, ma'am. They're too cramped, and the guests prefer the grand halls. I stick to the main routes." Her eyes darted to the passage door, then away, and Miss Marple noted the flush on her cheeks. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "You must know the castle well, though, guiding visitors every day." She paused, then added, "It must be hard with your mother so ill." "I heard in the village she's been poorly." Evelyn's eyes widened, her hands tightening on the tray. She's managing," she stammered. "I should go. The housekeeper's waiting." She hurried off, leaving Miss Marple to ponder the girl's unease. Poverty, she knew, could drive even the honest to desperate acts, and Evelyn's access to the staff key made her a figure worth watching. Returning to the library, Miss Marple found Lady Beatrice there, sorting through letters at a desk. "Jane, any thoughts?" Beatrice asked, her voice low, as if afraid of being overheard. "Only that the thief knew the castle's ways," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "The tapestry was taken with care, not haste. Someone familiar with the hall. The locks, perhaps even the passages." She did not mention the thread, not yet. It was too early to share such a fragile clue. Beatrice sighed, her hands twisting in her lap. "I trust my staff, Jane, but it feels like a betrayal. Clarence has been with us for years, Evelyn's a local girl, and the guests, well, they're respectable, aren't they?" "Respectability," Miss Marple said gently, "is often a mask. But we shall see." She smiled, but her mind was already weaving a pattern, with Clarence's nervous hands and Evelyn's flushed cheeks as threads to follow. The tapestry's absence was a puzzle, but human nature, she knew, would provide the key. As she resumed her knitting, her eyes lingered on the door through which Clarence had fled, and she wondered what other secrets the curator's devotion might hide. Chapter 4. The Guide's Hesitation. The afternoon sun struggled through the heavy clouds, casting a pallid glow over Haverford Castle's sprawling gardens. The mist from the morning storm had lifted, but the air remained damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and fading roses. Miss Jane Marple, having spent the morning in the library, decided a walk might clear her mind and offer a chance to observe the castle's inhabitants away from the stifling tension of the great hall. Her small, neat figure, clad in a sensible tweed coat and shawl, moved with quiet purpose along the gravel paths, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. The gardens, though past their summer prime, were meticulously tended, a testament to the estate's pride, despite its financial strains. Her thoughts were occupied by Miss Evelyn, the young tour guide whose nervous demeanour had stood out amidst the morning's chaos. Evelyn was a local girl, barely 20, with a delicate frame and auburn hair that seemed perpetually on the verge of escaping its pins. Her role at Haverford involved leading visitors through the castle's grand rooms, her voice soft but knowledgeable, as she recounted tales of its history. Yet this morning, when questioned by Inspector Grange, she had faltered, her hands twisting in her apron, her eyes avoiding the empty frame where the tapestry once hung. "I was in the staff quarters all night," she had said, her voice barely audible over the storm's lingering echoes. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in her corner, had noted the girl's flushed cheeks, the way her gaze darted to the door, as if longing to flee. Now, as Miss Marple rounded a hedge, she spotted Evelyn near the herb garden, kneeling to pull weeds with a vigour that seemed more distraction than duty. The girl's movements were quick, almost frantic, and her face, when she glanced up, bore the strain of worry. Miss Marple approached, her steps soft on the grass, her expression one of kindly interest. "Good afternoon, Evelyn," she said, her voice warm, but with a hint of curiosity that invited confidence. "The gardens are lovely, even in this dreary weather." "Do you often tend them?" Evelyn started, dropping a handful of weeds. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there." She brushed her hands on her skirt, her eyes flickering with unease. "No, ma'am, I don't usually. The gardener's short-handed today, so I thought I'd help." Her words came too quickly, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her voice. "How kind of you," Miss Marple said, settling onto a nearby bench, her knitting emerging from her bag with a familiar rustle. "It must be a comfort to keep busy, with all this upset over the tapestry. You must feel it keenly, guiding visitors past it every day." Evelyn nodded, her hands resuming their work, though her fingers fumbled. "It's awful, ma'am. The tapestry's the heart of the castle. I can't imagine who'd take it." Her voice was earnest, but her eyes remained fixed on the ground, avoiding Miss Marple's gentle scrutiny. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, a soothing rhythm that belied the sharpness of her mind. "You know the castle so well," she continued, her tone conversational. "All those tours, day after day. You must notice things. Visitors lingering too long, perhaps, or staff out of place." She paused, watching Evelyn's reaction. The girl's hands stilled, and for a moment she seemed to hold her breath. I don't know, ma'am. I just do my job. I don't pay much mind to what others do." Her words were halting, and Miss Marple observed the way her shoulders tensed, as if bracing for a blow. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "But a young woman as observant as you must see more than she lets on. I remember a girl in my village much like you, who noticed a stranger near the church one night. It solved a little mystery about a missing candlestick." Her tone was light, but her eyes were keen, noting the flush that deepened on Evelyn's cheeks. Evelyn stood abruptly, brushing dirt from her hands. "I should get back to the house," she said, her voice tight. "The housekeeper will be wanting me." She turned to go, but Miss Marple's next words stopped her. "I heard in the village your mother's been poorly," Miss Marple said gently. "It must be a worry. with doctor's bills and all. Haverford's wages are generous, I'm sure, but times are hard." Evelyn froze, her back to Miss Marple, her hands clenching at her sides. "She's managing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do what I can." Without another word she hurried away, her steps uneven on the gravel path. Miss Marple remained on the bench, her needles moving steadily as her mind pieced together the encounter. Evelyn's nervousness was more than shyness. It was the fear of someone with something to hide. The mention of her mother's illness had struck a nerve, and Miss Marple recalled a conversation with the castle's cook that morning, over a cup of tea in the kitchen. "Poor Evelyn's been run ragged," the cook had said, stirring a pot of soup. "Her mother's got a bad chest, and the bills are piling up. She's been sending most of her wages home. Poverty," Miss Marple knew, could tempt even the most honest soul, and Evelyn's access to the staff key made her a plausible candidate for the theft. Rising from the bench, Miss Marple made her way toward the staff quarters, her steps unhurried but purposeful. The castle's service wing was a warren of narrow corridors and small rooms, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the main house. She found the housekeeper, Mrs. Gibbs, in her office, a stern woman with a ledger open before her. Miss Marple, with her knack for putting people at ease, engaged her in a chat about the castle's routines. "The staff key to the Great Hall," Miss Marple said, her tone casual as she admired a vase of late roses on the desk. "Is it kept here, or do the guides carry it?" Mrs. Gibbs frowned, her pen pausing. "It's kept in this office, locked in a drawer," she said. "Only I have the key to the drawer, though Evelyn or the others might borrow it for tours. They always return it." Her voice was firm, but Miss Marple detected a hint of unease, as if the theft had shaken her trust in her own system. "And last night," Miss Marple pressed gently, her needles clicking in her lap, "was the key in its place?" Mrs. Gibbs hesitated, then rose to open a small drawer in her desk. She produced a brass key, its surface worn from years of use. "It was here this morning, as always," she said, but her brow furrowed. "I suppose someone could have taken it and returned it, but I'd have noticed if it was gone for long." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the detail. A key borrowed and returned in the night was possible, especially if the thief moved quickly under cover of the storm. Evelyn, with her daily access to the hall, would know its routines intimately. Yet her youth and apparent loyalty to Haverford made Miss Marple hesitate to condemn her. People are complex, she thought, recalling a young maid in Sant, Mary Mead, who had stolen to pay for a sick child's medicine, her guilt betrayed by her trembling hands. As she left the housekeeper's office, Miss Marple caught sight of Evelyn in the corridor, speaking in hushed tones with the gardener, a grizzled man named Tompkins. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they saw her, and Evelyn's face flushed again, her eyes dropping to the floor. Tompkins tipped his cap and shuffled off, leaving Miss Marple to ponder the exchange. Was Evelyn confiding in him, or warning him to stay silent? The gardener, she recalled, had access to the grounds and stables, where a tapestry might be hidden. A partnership, perhaps, driven by shared desperation. Returning to the main house, Miss Marple found Inspector Grange in the great hall, his frustration evident as he conferred with the constable. "Nothing," he growled, kicking at a chair. "No footprints, no fibres, no sign of how they got it out." "It's as if the thing sprouted legs," Miss Marple, settling into her usual chair. offered a small smile. "Patience, Inspector. The tapestry is large, but the castle is larger. It's here or nearby, and someone knows where." Her voice was calm, but her mind was racing, piecing together Evelyn's hesitation, the key's accessibility, and the crimson thread from the servant's passage. The girl's fear suggested involvement, but whether as thief or accomplice remained unclear. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple resolved to watch Evelyn closely, her instincts telling her the girl's secret was a thread in the larger pattern. The tapestry's theft was no random act. It was a calculated move by someone who knew the castle's heart. And Evelyn, with her nervous hands and burdened heart, was a figure worth unravelling. Chapter 5. The Scholar's Disinterest. The evening shadows lengthened across Haverford Castle, their edges softened by the lingering damp of the storm's aftermath. The great hall, now a sombre stage for the morning's discovery, stood quiet, its empty frame a silent accusation. Miss Jane Marple, having spent the day observing the subtle currents of suspicion among the castle's inhabitants, retired to the drawing-room, where a fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the faded tapestries and polished furniture. Her knitting needles moved with their usual rhythm, a steady click that belied the whirl of her thoughts. Her attention had turned to Dr. Harrow, the scholarly guest whose detachment from the theft's drama piqued her curiosity. Dr. Harrow was a man in his late 40s, with a greying beard and a stoop that suggested hours bent over manuscripts. His presence at Haverford was due to Lady Beatrice's invitation, extended because of his expertise in medieval art, though his interest seemed confined to illuminated manuscripts rather than woven treasures like the stolen tapestry. This evening he sat in a corner of the drawing-room, his nose buried in a thick volume, his spectacles glinting in the firelight. To the casual observer, he was a man apart, absorbed in his studies, untouched by the castle's turmoil. But Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beneath surfaces, sensed something amiss in his studied disinterest. She recalled his response to Inspector Grange's questioning that morning. "I was reading in my room," he had said, holding up a worn copy of The Art of the Renaissance, as if it were proof of his innocence. His voice had been calm, almost dismissive, but Miss Marple had noted the tightness in his grip, the way his eyes avoided the empty frame. It was the kind of detachment that felt practiced, like a vicar in Smoot. Mary Mead, who had once claimed ignorance of a parish scandal, while his hands betrayed his guilt with restless fidgeting. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate, and approached the bookshelf near Dr. Harrow, feigning interest in a volume of local history. "Dr. Harrow," she said, her voice gentle but carrying a hint of curiosity. "You must find Haverford a treasure trove for your studies. So many artifacts, so much history." She smiled, her eyes crinkling behind her spectacles. He looked up, his expression polite but guarded. "Indeed, Miss Marple." "The castle's archives are remarkable. I've been cataloguing some of the older manuscripts for Lady Beatrice." He gestured to his notebook, open on the table, its pages filled with precise annotations. "The tapestry's loss is unfortunate, of course, but my work lies elsewhere." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her needles pausing as she met his gaze. "Though I imagine a scholar like you would appreciate its craftsmanship, even if it's not your specialty. Did you ever study it closely?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. watching for any flicker of unease. Dr. Harrow adjusted his spectacles, a small gesture that Miss Marple noted as a delay. "I glanced at it naturally," he said. "A fine piece, but not my field. I'm more concerned with vellum than thread." He offered a thin smile, returning to his book as if to close the conversation. Miss Marple nodded, undeterred, and settled into a nearby chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. She recalled an incident from the previous day when she'd found Dr. Harrow in the library, poring over estate records that included the tapestry's provenance. "Just verifying its history," he had said when she inquired, but his haste to close the ledger had struck her as odd. A scholar's curiosity was natural, but why focus on a piece he claimed held little interest? Her thoughts were interrupted by Lady Beatrice, who entered the drawing room, her face still pale with worry. "Jane, have you seen Clarence? He's been fretting all day, poor man. Says the theft's a stain on his reputation." She sank into a chair, her hands twisting in her lap. "He's a dedicated man," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing, "but worry can cloud judgment. Tell me, Beatrice, does Dr. Harrow often work in the library? He seems so absorbed in his studies." She glanced at the scholar, who appeared not to hear, his head bent over his book. "Oh, yes," Beatrice replied. "He's been there every day since he arrived, going through old records. He says it's for a paper he's writing, but I think he just loves the past." She sighed, her eyes drifting to the doorway leading to the great hall. "I wish he'd take more interest in our present troubles." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind turning over the scholar's habits. A man immersed in records might stumble across valuable information, perhaps even the tapestry's worth or its vulnerabilities. She resolved to visit the library again, to see what Dr. Harrow's research might reveal. The opportunity came the next morning, when the castle was quiet, the inspector and his constable occupied with questioning the staff. Miss Marple slipped into the library, its air heavy with the scent of old leather and dust. Dr. Harrow was there, as expected, seated at a table strewn with documents. He looked up as she entered, his expression one of mild surprise. "Miss Marple," he said, "you're an early riser." "As you," she replied, her smile disarming. "I thought I might look at some of Haverford's history myself. The tapestry's loss has made me curious about its origins." She approached the table, her eyes scanning the papers before him. Among them was a ledger detailing the estate's artifacts, open to a page about the tapestry. A pencil mark circled its estimated value, £150,000. Dr. Harrow followed her gaze and closed the ledger with a casual air. "Just cross-referencing some details," he said. "The tapestry's history is tangled. Provenance is often unclear with such pieces." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hand lingered on the ledger's cover. "How fascinating," she said, her tone encouraging. "Have you found anything interesting? Perhaps a clue to why someone might want it." She watched him closely, her needles clicking softly in her bag, a sound that seemed to steady her thoughts. He shook his head, his smile thin. "Nothing concrete. It's a valuable piece, of course, but its theft seems more a matter for the police than a scholar." He rose, gathering his papers. "If you'll excuse me, I have notes to organize." As he left, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the table, where a single sheet remained, overlooked in his haste. It was a handwritten note, in Harrow's precise script, listing names of art dealers in London, alongside the words private sale. She tucked the note into her pocket, her mind racing. Was Dr. Harrow merely researching, or was he connected to a network that might covet the tapestry? A scholar's detachment could mask a deeper motive, just as a quiet vicar in Saunt. Mary Mead had once hidden his greed behind a pious facade. Later that day, Miss Marple joined Lady Beatrice for tea in the drawing-room, where the conversation turned to the castle's guests. "Dr. Harrow's so quiet," Beatrice remarked, pouring tea. "Always scribbling in that notebook of his." "I wonder if he even notices the theft." "Oh, he notices," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "Scholars see more than they let on. Their minds are trained to find patterns, just as mine is." She sipped her tea, her thoughts on the note in her pocket. A private sale suggested a buyer, perhaps one doctor. Harrow knew, but was he the thief, or merely a conduit for another's greed? As the day drew to a close, Miss Marple strolled the castle's corridors, her steps taking her past Doctor. Harrow's room. The door was ajar, and she glimpsed him inside, speaking in low tones on a telephone, a rarity in the castle's guest wing. She caught only fragments. Discreet, value, soon. His voice was clipped, urgent, and Miss Marple's heart quickened. She retreated before he noticed, her mind weaving a new thread into the pattern. Dr. Harrow's disinterest, she decided, was a facade, much like the calm surface of a village pond hiding currents below. His knowledge of the tapestry's value, his access to the library's records, and his mysterious call suggested a role in the theft, whether direct or indirect. Yet she needed more, evidence to tie him to the crime, or to unravel his true purpose at Haverford. As her needles clicked into the evening, Miss Marple knew the scholar's secrets were a thread worth pulling, one that might lead her closer to the vanished tapestry. Chapter 6. The Collector's Ambition. The late afternoon light filtered through Haverford Castle's mullioned windows, casting intricate patterns across the polished floors of the drawing-room. The fire in the hearth crackled, its warmth a frail defence against the chill that seemed to seep from the castle's stone walls, as if the theft of the tapestry had robbed the place of its vitality. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles moving with a steady rhythm, their soft clicks a counterpoint to the murmur of conversation among the castle's occupants. Her thoughts, however, were fixed on Mr. Vane, the wealthy collector whose polished charm and keen interest in the Haverford tapestry had not escaped her notice. Mr. Vane was a man of 40, with the sleek confidence of one accustomed to getting what he wanted. His tailored suits and easy smile marked him as a gentleman of means, but his eyes, sharp and calculating, betrayed a hunger that Miss Marple recognized from her years of observing human nature. At dinner the previous evening, he had spoken of the tapestry with a reverence that bordered on obsession, describing its crimson and gold threads as a masterpiece worthy of a king's ransom. His words had been met with polite interest, but Miss Marple had noted the intensity in his gaze, the way his fingers lingered on his wineglass, as if restraining a deeper impulse. Now, as she watched him across the drawing-room, he stood by the window, his posture relaxed, but his eyes restless, scanning the room as if measuring its occupants. Lady Beatrice, attempting to maintain a semblance of normalcy, was discussing the evening's menu with the housekeeper, while Inspector Grange, ever present, conferred with his constable in low tones near the door. The other suspects, Mr. Clarence, Miss Evelyn, and Dr. Harrow, were absent, occupied with their own tasks or alibis, leaving Vane as the focus of Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny. She recalled his alibi from the morning's questioning. "I slept through the storm, undisturbed until dawn." His voice had been smooth, his smile unwavering, but Miss Marple had noticed his polished shoes, free of the mud that coated the castle's grounds after the storm. A man who claimed to have stayed in his room all night should not have such pristine footwear, unless he had taken care to avoid the elements, or to cover his tracks. She also remembered a moment after dinner, when Vane had excused himself for a glass of water, and was seen lingering in the corridor near the great hall. A small detail, but Miss Marple knew that small details often unravelled great mysteries. Rising from her chair, she approached the window, her steps light, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. "Mr. Vane," she said, her voice warm with the gentle curiosity of an elderly aunt, "you must find Haverford's collection fascinating. A man of your tastes surely appreciates its treasures." Vane turned, his smile quick and practised. "Oh, immensely, Miss Marple. The tapestry, in particular, was a gem. Its loss is a tragedy for the art world." His tone was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the slight pause, the way his eyes flicked to the doorway leading to the great hall. "Indeed," she said, settling into a nearby chair, her needles resuming their work. "You spoke so eloquently about it at dinner. Have you seen many such pieces in your collection? I imagine you've a keen eye for their value." Her words were innocent, but her gaze was steady, watching for any crack in his composure. Vane's smile tightened, just for a moment. "I've acquired a few tapestries over the years," he said, his voice casual, "but none quite like Haverford's. Its provenance, its craftsmanship, it's unique." He leaned against the window frame, his posture relaxed, but Miss Marple observed the way his fingers brushed the cuff of his sleeve, a nervous gesture disguised as nonchalance. "How fortunate you were to see it before it vanished," she said, her tone light. "Though I suppose a collector like you might know where such a piece could be appreciated if it were to find a new home." She let the words hang, her eyes crinkling with a smile that invited confidence. Vane's expression flickered, a shadow of unease crossing his face before his smile returned. "I'm afraid I'm no help there, Miss Marple. My interest is purely academic. A piece like that belongs in a place like Haverford, not some private vault." He straightened, glancing at his watch. "If you'll excuse me, I have some letters to write." As he left, Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over the encounter. Vane's charm was a polished shield, but his unease at her probing suggested a deeper involvement. She recalled a snippet of village gossip from St. Mary Mead, where a wealthy visitor had coveted a rare painting, his smooth denials masking a plot to acquire it. Vane's ambition, she suspected, was similar, a collector's greed that might drive him to theft. Her thoughts were interrupted by Lady Beatrice, who approached with a weary sigh. "Jane, this dreadful business is wearing me down. Mr. Vane seems so composed, but I can't help wondering. He was so taken with the tapestry." Her voice was low, her eyes searching Miss Marple's face for reassurance. "Composure can hide many things," Miss Marple said gently, her needles clicking. "Mr. Vane's interest in the tapestry is clear. But whether it's innocent remains to be seen. Tell me, Beatrice, has he ever inquired about purchasing it?" Beatrice frowned, her hands smoothing her skirt. "Not directly, but he did ask about its history, its value. He said it was for his studies, but I wondered if he was testing the waters. I told him it was a family heirloom, not for sale." Her voice held a note of indignation, as if the suggestion offended her. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information. A collector rebuffed might turn to other means, especially one with Vane's resources. She resolved to learn more about his movements the night of the theft. The servants' passages, where she had found the crimson thread, were a likely route for the tapestry's removal, and Vane, as a guest, might have explored the castle's layout during his stay. The opportunity to probe further came later that evening, when Miss Marple joined the household for dinner. The atmosphere was strained, the empty frame casting a shadow over the table. Vane, seated across from her, maintained his charm, engaging doctor. Harrow in a discussion about Renaissance art. Miss Marple listened, her ears attuned to any slip. When Vane mentioned a recent auction in London, where a lesser tapestry had fetched a high price, she seized the chance. "Such sums must tempt collectors," she said, her voice mild, as she buttered a roll. "I suppose a piece like the Haverford Tapestry would attract many buyers, if it were ever offered. Do you know of such markets, Mr. Vane?" His fork paused mid-air, a fleeting hesitation that Miss Marple noted. "I keep an eye on the art world, of course," he said, his smile unwavering, "but I prefer to admire pieces in their rightful homes, like this castle." His words were smooth, but his eyes held a guarded glint, as if wary of her intent. Miss Marple smiled, her needles resting in her lap. "How admirable," she said, "though I imagine some collectors might go to great lengths to possess such a treasure." She let the comment linger, watching as Vane's smile tightened, his fingers brushing his cuff again. After dinner, as the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered in the corridor, her steps slow as she passed the guest wing. She noticed Vane's door, slightly ajar, and heard the rustle of papers inside. Peering cautiously, she saw him at a desk, examining a map of the castle's grounds, his finger tracing a path toward the stables. Her heart quickened, but she withdrew before he could notice, her mind racing. The stables, accessible via the servants' passages, were a plausible hiding place for a large tapestry, and Vane's interest in them suggested a plan beyond mere admiration. Returning to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting forgotten as she pieced together the threads of Vane's behaviour. His ambition, his knowledge of the tapestry's value, his pristine shoes, and now his study of the castle's layout, all pointed to a man with more than a passing interest in the theft. Yet she needed evidence, something to link him to the tapestry's removal. The crimson thread from the passage was a start, but it implicated no one directly. Vane's charm, she knew, was a mask, much like the polished exterior of a village squire who had once coveted a neighbour's land, his greed hidden behind genial smiles. As the castle settled into the night, Miss Marple resolved to keep a closer eye on Vane, perhaps even to test him with a subtle trap. The tapestry was still within reach, she felt certain, and Vane's ambition was a thread that might lead her to it, if she could only pull it without snapping. Chapter 7. Threads of Evidence. The morning after the strained dinner at Haverford Castle dawned with a brittle clarity. the sky scrubbed clean by the storm's departure. The castle's ancient walls seemed to hold their breath, as if waiting for the next revelation in the mystery of the vanished tapestry. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, stood at her window overlooking the mist-draped grounds, her thoughts weaving through the tangle of clues and suspicions that had accumulated over the past days. Her knitting lay untouched on the bedside table, a rare pause in her usual rhythm, as her mind focused on the delicate threads of evidence that might unravel the theft. The great hall, with its empty frame, remained the heart of the mystery, and Miss Marple decided to revisit it before the household stirred. Slipping on her sensible shoes and shawl, she made her way through the silent corridors, her steps muffled by the thick rugs. The hall was as she had left it, its vastness amplified by the absence of the tapestry's vibrant presence. The oak frame stood like a sentinel, its brass fastenings gleaming faintly in the morning light, filtering through the high windows. She approached it, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, searching for any overlooked detail. Kneeling with care, she examined the floor beneath the frame, her fingers brushing the polished wood. The surface was pristine, swept clean by the diligent staff, but near the base of the frame she noticed a faint smudge, barely discernible, a trace of wax perhaps or grease. It was not much, but Miss Marple knew that small traces could lead to great truths. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a smear of boot polish on a vicarage step had pointed to a thief's midnight exit. Tucking the observation away, she rose and turned her attention to the room's edges, where the servants' passages opened behind discreet panels. It was in one such passage, as she had discovered earlier, that she'd found the crimson thread, a silent witness to the tapestry's removal. She returned to the spot now, her small torch casting a beam along the narrow corridor. The walls were rough stone, cold to the touch, and the air carried the musty scent of disuse. The thread was still there, caught on a splintered edge, its vivid hue a stark contrast to the grey stone. She examined it again, confirming its match to the tapestry's weave, and then scanned the passage for further signs. A few paces beyond, she found another clue. A tiny chip of paint, dark green, lodged in a crack in the floor. It was an oddity in the passage's monochrome palette, and she pocketed it carefully, her mind turning over its possible origins. The passage led toward the stables, a fact she had noted before, and she decided to follow it, her steps cautious to avoid disturbing any evidence. The corridor twisted through the castle's underbelly, its low ceiling forcing her to stoop slightly. At its end, a heavy door opened to the stable yard, where the air was sharp with the scent of hay and damp earth. The yard was empty, the grooms not yet at work, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the muddy ground near the door. The storm's rains had left the earth soft, and there, faintly pressed into the mire, were the outlines of footprints, large, masculine, with a deep tread that suggested boots. They led toward the stables but faded into the gravel beyond, where the ground was firmer. She knelt again, her joints protesting, and studied the prints. They were fresh, likely from the night of the theft, and their size ruled out Miss Evelyn, but implicated the men, Mr. Clarence, Dr. Harrow, or Mr. Vane. The green paint chip nagged at her memory. It resembled the shade of the stable doors, suggesting someone had brushed against them in their haste. She made a mental note to check the boots of the male suspects, if Inspector Granger's search permitted it. Returning to the main house, Miss Marple found the inspector in the dining room, his face etched with frustration as he reviewed his notes. "Nothing new, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff. "We've searched the grounds, the outbuildings, nothing. That tapestry's either hidden better than a needle in a haystack, or it's already miles away." "Patience, Inspector," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair, her knitting emerging from her bag. "The tapestry is large and delicate. It cannot be far. These footprints in the stable-yard, have you examined them?" Her tone was mild, but her eyes were keen, watching his reaction. Granger's brow furrowed. "Footprints?" The constable checked the yard, but the rain washed most traces away. "What did you see?" "Large prints near the servants' passage door," she said, her needles clicking. "They suggest someone moved through there, perhaps with a heavy load." And this, she produced the green paint chip, holding it delicately in her handkerchief. "It may be nothing, but it was in the passage, near a thread from the tapestry." Grange took the chip, his eyes narrowing. "Could be from the stables. We'll check it against the doors. Good work, Miss Marple, though I wish you'd leave the sleuthing to us." His tone was grudging, but a flicker of respect crossed his face. Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "I only observe, Inspector. The castle tells its own story, if one listens." She resumed her knitting, her mind turning to the suspects. The footprints and paint chip pointed to a physical act, one requiring strength and familiarity with the castle's hidden roots. Mr. Vane's pristine shoes came to mind, a puzzle in themselves. How had he avoided the mud? Dr. Harrow's detachment seemed less likely to mask such boldness, but his secretive phone call lingered in her thoughts. And Mr. Clarence, with his nervous hands and knowledge of the castle's locks, could not be dismissed. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple joined Lady Beatrice for a walk in the gardens, hoping to glean more about the castle's routines. Beatrice, still shaken by the theft, spoke of the staff's loyalty and the guests' respectability, but her voice faltered when Miss Marple mentioned the stables. "The grooms reported a cart missing this morning," Beatrice admitted, her hands twisting. "Just a small one, used for supplies. It was found near the village, abandoned. Do you think it's connected?" Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained calm. "It may be," she said. "A cart could carry a tapestry, if rolled carefully." "Has the inspector examined it?" "He's sending the constable now," Beatrice said, her eyes wide. "Oh, Jane, I can't bear the thought of someone here betraying us." Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her voice soothing. "Betrayal is often born of need or greed, Beatrice. We shall find the truth." Her mind raced, picturing the tapestry, rolled and hidden, spirited away in a cart under cover of the storm. The footprints suggested a man, but the cart implied a plan, perhaps involving an accomplice outside the castle. Later at luncheon, Miss Marple observed the suspects, their interactions strained under the weight of suspicion. Mr. Vane was absent, claiming a headache, but Miss Marple noted his absence with interest. Perhaps he was avoiding scrutiny. Dr. Harrow ate in silence, his notebook closed beside him, while Mr. Clarence picked at his food, his eyes darting to the door. Miss Evelyn, serving the meal, moved with a quiet efficiency, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured water, a detail Miss Marple filed away. After the meal, she sought out the constable, who had returned from the village. The cart was empty, he reported, his voice low. No traces of the tapestry, but there were some wool fibres caught in the wood, red like the tapestry's threads. The inspectors having them checked, Miss Marple nodded, her mind adding the fibres to her growing pattern of clues. The crimson thread, the green paint chip, the footprints, and now the wool fibres. All pointed to a careful but hurried removal through the servants' passage to the stables. The cart suggested an attempt to move the tapestry beyond the castle, but its abandonment hinted at a plan interrupted. Someone, she felt certain, was still hiding the truth, and the clues were threads leading to their unravelling. As she returned to her room, her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a metronome. The tapestry was close. She could sense it, hidden in the castle shadows or nearby. The evidence was mounting, but it was the human heart, with its desires and fears, that would reveal the thief. Miss Marple's eyes, bright behind her spectacles, scanned the horizon, her mind weaving the threads into a pattern that grew clearer with each passing hour. Chapter 8. A Conversation Over Tea. The afternoon at Haverford Castle settled into a deceptive calm, the kind that follows a storm but precedes a revelation. The air in the drawing-room was warm, scented with the faint sweetness of chamomile tea and the lingering smokiness of the hearth's dying fire. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favoured armchair by the window, arranged a tea tray with the precision of a hostess, though her true purpose was observation. Her knitting needles lay idle for once, tucked into her bag, as she prepared to draw the suspects into a setting where their guards might slip. The tapestry's theft had cast a pall over the castle, and she sensed that the truth lay not in grand discoveries, but in the small, unguarded moments of human interaction. Lady Beatrice, ever eager to maintain civility despite the crisis, had agreed to Miss Marple's suggestion of an informal tea. "It will do us good to gather," she had said, though her eyes betrayed her anxiety. The invitation was extended to the suspects, Mr. Clarence, Miss Evelyn, Dr. Harrow, and Mr. Vane, each of whom arrived with varying degrees of reluctance. The room, with its faded velvet curtains and polished mahogany table, seemed a stage for Miss Marple's quiet performance, her gentle demeanour a mask for the sharp mind that catalogued every glance and gesture. Mr. Clarence entered first, his thin frame rigid with tension, his hands clutching a handkerchief as if it were a talisman against suspicion. He nodded curtly to Miss Marple and took a seat near the fire, his eyes avoiding the doorway to the great hall, where the empty frame loomed like a silent accuser. Miss Evelyn followed, her auburn hair neatly pinned but her hands twisting in her apron, a habit Miss Marple had come to recognize as a sign of her unease. Dr. Harrow arrived next, his spectacles glinting as he carried his ever-present notebook. His expression one of detached curiosity, as if the gathering were a lecture to be endured. Mr. Vane was last, his tailored suit impeccable, his smile as polished as ever, though Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw as he surveyed the room. "Tea, how charming," Vane said, his voice smooth as he accepted a cup from Lady Beatrice. "A moment of normalcy in this unfortunate affair." He settled into a chair, his posture relaxed, but his eyes flicked to Miss Marple, as if sensing her scrutiny. "Normalcy is a comfort," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild, her eyes crinkling with a smile that invited trust. though I find a good conversation often reveals more than one expects. Don't you agree, Mr. Clarence?" She turned to the curator, who started slightly, his handkerchief crumpling in his hand. "Oh, yes, I suppose," he stammered, his voice clipped, "though there's little to say until the tapestry is found." His eyes darted to Evelyn, who was pouring tea with a trembling hand, and Miss Marple noted the fleeting exchange, a tension unspoken but palpable. She handed a cup to Evelyn, her voice gentle. "You must be weary, my dear, with all this upset. Guiding visitors through the castle is such a responsibility, knowing every detail of its treasures." Her words were kind, but her gaze was steady, watching as Evelyn's cheeks flushed, her fingers nearly spilling the tea. "It's my job, ma'am," Evelyn said, her voice low. "I just try to do it well." She retreated to the tray, busying herself with the sugar bowl, but Miss Marple observed the way her shoulder hunched, as if shielding herself from questions. Turning to Dr. Harrow, Miss Marple offered a biscuit with a smile. "Your studies must keep you busy, Doctor." "Harrow, have you found anything in the archives to shed light on the tapestry's history? Its story might hint at why someone coveted it." Her tone was casual, but her eyes missed nothing, noting the way Harrow's hand paused on his notebook. "It's a complex piece," he said, his voice measured. "Its provenance is murky, passed through many hands before Haverford." "But I'm no detective, Miss Marple. My interest is academic." He opened his notebook, scribbling a note, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his pen, a sign of unease beneath his scholarly facade. Mr. Vane, sipping his tea, interjected with a laugh. "Come now, Miss Marple, you sound like you're sleuthing. Surely you don't suspect us all of plotting over this tapestry?" His tone was light, but his eyes held a challenge, as if testing her intent. "Oh, I suspect nothing," she said, her smile disarming. "I only observe." "People are so revealing when they talk, don't you think? A collector like you, Mr. Vane, must have stories of treasures sought and won." She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but probing. "Have you ever come across a piece like the Haverford Tapestry in your travels?" Vane's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered. "Not quite," he said, his voice smooth. "It's one of a kind, which makes its loss all the more tragic. I'd have loved to study it further, but alas, it's gone." He set his cup down, his fingers brushing his cuff, a gesture Miss Marple had come to recognize as his tell of discomfort. She steered the conversation to the tapestry's history, drawing out each suspect's knowledge. Mr. Clarence spoke of its maintenance, his voice tight with pride but edged with worry, as if the theft were a personal failing. Evelyn offered a halting account of its role in her tours, her words stumbling when Miss Marple asked if visitors ever lingered too long near it. Dr. Harrow recited dry facts about its weave, his detachment almost too perfect, while Vane's description was vivid, almost proprietary, as if he had memorized every thread. "Such a piece must attract many eyes," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "I wonder if it caught the eye of a private collector, someone who might keep it hidden away." She looked at Vane as she spoke, her eyes gentle but unyielding, and saw his smile stiffen, his fingers pausing on his saucer. "Nonsense," he said, his voice a shade too sharp. "No true collector would hide such a treasure. It belongs in a place like Haverford. For all to see, his words were fervent." But Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flicked to Clarence, as if seeking an ally, or gauging a rival? The conversation drifted to safer topics, but Miss Marple's mind was busy, cataloguing the interplay of glances and silences. Clarence's avoidance of Vane's gaze suggested a rift, perhaps born of suspicion or shared secrets. Evelyn's fidgeting intensified when the keys to the Great Hall were mentioned, her eyes darting to the door. Harrow's scribbling, ostensibly notes on the tapestry's history, seemed a shield against scrutiny, and Vane's charm, though polished, cracked under her gentle probing, revealing a man who knew more than he admitted. As the tea concluded, the suspects dispersed, each with an excuse. Clarence to check the locks, Evelyn to assist the housekeeper, Harrow to his archives, Vane to his letters. Miss Marple remained, helping Lady Beatrice clear the tray, her thoughts weaving the day's observations into a pattern. "Guilt hides in small gestures," she murmured, her voice lost in the clink of china. "And ambition speaks loudest when it thinks it's unheard." Later, in her room, she examined the clues she had gathered. The crimson thread, the green paint chip, the wool fibres from the cart, and now the tensions revealed over tea. Vane's proprietary knowledge of the tapestry, coupled with his unease at her questions, made him a compelling figure. But Clarence's nervousness, Evelyn's fear, and Harrow's secrecy could not be dismissed. The tapestry, she felt certain, was still close, its thief betrayed by the very human flaws they sought to conceal. As she resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like a metronome, Miss Marple's mind turned to the next step. A trap, perhaps, to test the suspect's reactions, or a closer look at the stables where the cart had been taken. The truth was near, woven into the fabric of Haverford's secrets, and she was determined to unravel it, thread by careful thread. Chapter 9. The Hidden Motive. The pale light of a September morning crept through the leaded windows of Haverford Castle, softening the edges of its ancient stonework, but doing little to lift the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the household. The theft of the tapestry, now 2 days past, hung like a spectre, its absence a constant reminder of betrayal lurking within the castle's walls. Miss Jane Marple, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human behaviour, sensed that the key to the mystery lay not only in physical clues, but in the motives that drove the suspects. Her morning walk took her beyond the castle grounds to the nearby village of Haverford Green, where gossip, she knew, could reveal truths hidden from formal inquiries. Dressed in her sensible tweed coat and a hat pinned firmly against the breeze, Miss Marple strolled along the cobbled lane, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side. The village was a quaint cluster of thatched cottages and a single pub, the Red Stag, where locals gathered to exchange news over pints and teacups. She entered the post office, a small shop scented with ink and wax, where the postmaster, Mr. Dobbs, greeted her with a nod. His wife, bustling behind the counter, was known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory, a trait Miss Marple intended to exploit. "Good morning, Mrs. Dobbs," she said, her voice warm with the disarming charm of an elderly visitor. "I'm staying at the castle, and I thought I'd post a letter to my nephew. Such a pity about the tapestry, isn't it?" She produced a letter from her bag, her eyes crinkling as she watched the woman's reaction. Mrs. Dobbs's face lit with indignation. "A scandal, that's what it is. That tapestry's been in Haverford for centuries, and now it's gone, snatched in the night. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say that Mr. Vane, the collector fellow, was sniffing around it last month. Came to the castle, bold as brass, asking Lady Beatrice if she'd consider selling. She sent him packing, mind you, said it wasn't for sale at any price." Miss Marple's needles, though still in her bag, seemed to click in her mind, marking the rhythm of a new thread. "How interesting," she said, her tone mild. "Mr. Vane does seem fond of fine things. Was he very put out, do you think?" Mrs. Dobbs snorted, her hands busy sorting envelopes. "Put out? He was furious, or so the gardener told me. Said the tapestry belonged in a proper collection, not rotting in a draughty castle. As if Haverford's not grand enough for the likes of him." She shook her head, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of gossip. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite concern. "A man with such passion for art might take rejection hard," she mused, handing over her letter. "Thank you, Mrs. Dobbs. You've been most helpful." As she left the post office, her mind was already weaving this new information into the pattern. Vane's attempt to buy the tapestry, rebuffed by Lady Beatrice, suggested a motive deeper than admiration. A collector's pride, wounded by refusal, could turn to theft, especially for a man with Vane's resources and ambition. Returning to the castle, Miss Marple sought out Lady Beatrice, finding her in the morning room, sorting through correspondence with a distracted air. "Jane, you're back," Beatrice said, her voice weary. "Any news from the village?" "I'm afraid the inspector's search has turned up nothing but that wretched cart." "Nothing definite," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair, her knitting emerging with a soft rustle. "But I heard Mr. Vane inquired about buying the tapestry some weeks ago. Is that true?" Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching her friend's reaction. Beatrice's hands paused, her face tightening. "Yes, it's true." He was quite persistent, offered a handsome sum. "I told him the tapestry was a family heirloom, not for sale." He was polite enough, but I sensed he was displeased. She sighed, her fingers twisting a letter. "Do you think he could have—" "It's possible," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking steadily. "A man used to acquiring what he wants might not take kindly to refusal. But we mustn't jump to conclusions." Her words were cautious, but her mind was racing, piecing together Vane's ambition with the clues she'd gathered, the crimson thread, the green paint chip, the wool fibres in the cart, and the footprints near the stables. Determined to explore the stables further, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way to the yard, where the air was sharp with the scent of straw and leather. The stables, a low stone building adjacent to the castle, were quiet, the grooms busy elsewhere. She approached the door where she had found the footprints, noting again the green paint that matched the chip from the passage. Inside, the stalls were orderly, but her eyes were drawn to a corner where a pile of straw seemed disturbed, as if hastily rearranged. Kneeling with care, she brushed aside the straw, revealing a wooden trapdoor, its edges worn but sturdy. Lifting it, she found a small cellar damp and dark, used for storing old tack and supplies. Her torch beam revealed nothing obvious, no tapestry, but a faint scent of aged wool lingered. And in the dust, she spotted another crimson thread, identical to the one from the passage. Her heart quickened. The tapestry had been here, or near here, before being moved. The cellar's proximity to the cart's departure point suggested a hiding place, temporary but strategic. As she emerged, she encountered Tompkins the gardener, his grizzled face wary as he carried a rake. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his eyes flicking to the trapdoor. "Checking the stables, are you?" "Nothing much to see here. Just curious," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I heard a cart was taken from here the night of the theft." "Did you see anything unusual, Mr. Tompkins?" Her tone was light, but her gaze was steady, noting his hesitation. "Didn't see nothing," he said gruffly, adjusting his cap. "Storm was too loud, and I was in my cottage." Cart was gone by dawn, found in the village. His words were quick, his eyes avoiding hers, and Miss Marple recalled his hushed conversation with Evelyn, suggesting a connection she had yet to unravel. Thanking him, she returned to the castle, her mind buzzing with the new clues: the crimson thread in the cellar, the cart's abandonment, and Vane's rebuffed offer painted a picture of a calculated theft, thwarted perhaps by an unexpected obstacle. She sought out Inspector Grange, finding him in the great hall, his notebook open as he reviewed the case's meagre findings. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but firm, "have you checked the stable cellar? I found a thread there, like the one from the passage. And the cart? Any news of who might have driven it?" Grange's eyebrows rose, his expression a mix of irritation and grudging respect. "You've been busy, Miss Marple." "We looked at the stables, but not the cellar. I'll send the constable. As for the cart, no witnesses yet, but those wool fibres suggest it carried something heavy, maybe rolled up." He scratched his chin, his eyes narrowing. "You're thinking Vane, aren't you? He's got the motive, with his collectors. Itch I think nothing yet," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "But motives are like threads, Inspector. Pull the right one, and the pattern emerges." She left him to his work, her mind turning to Vane's polished exterior and the possibility that his ambition had driven him to steal what he could not buy. Back in her room, she examined her clues: the crimson threads, the paint chip, the wool fibres, and now the village gossip about Vane's offer. Each pointed to a plan executed with care, likely by someone with access to the castle's hidden roots and the means to move a large tapestry. Vane's wealth and connections made him a prime candidate, but she needed more: a slip, a confession, or a trace of the tapestry itself. As her needles resumed their clicking, Miss Marple felt the truth drawing closer, hidden in the motives of a man whose ambition had outstripped his scruples. Chapter 10. The Trap. The third day since the theft of the Haverford tapestry dawned with a restless energy, as if the castle itself yearned for resolution. The morning light, pale and sharp, pierced the lingering clouds, illuminating the great hall's empty frame with a stark clarity that seemed to mock the ongoing mystery. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her small writing desk in her guest room, pondered the web of clues she had gathered. The crimson threads, the green paint chip, the wool fibres from the abandoned cart, and the village gossip about Mr. Vane's thwarted attempt to purchase the tapestry. Each thread pointed to a calculated act, but the thief's identity remained elusive, hidden behind carefully crafted alibis and guarded glances. Her knitting needles, resting on the desk, were silent for now, her mind too occupied with the next step: a subtle trap to coax the truth into the open. Miss Marple knew that human nature, when pressed, often betrayed itself in small, unguarded moments. In her village of St. Mary Mead, she had once flushed out a thief by letting slip a rumour that a witness had seen him near the crime, prompting a guilty panic that led to his confession. A similar strategy, she decided, might work at Haverford. The suspects, Mr. Clarence, Miss Evelyn, Dr. Harrow and Mr. Vane, were under strain, their nerves frayed by Inspector Grange's relentless questioning and the castle's oppressive atmosphere. A well-placed hint, delivered with care, could provoke a reaction that would unravel the mystery. She sought out Inspector Grange in the morning room, where he was reviewing reports with his constable, his face etched with the frustration of a man chasing shadows. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but deliberate, "I've been thinking about those footprints in the stable yard. They suggest someone moved the tapestry that night, perhaps to the cart. Have you considered letting it be known that a witness saw someone near the stables during the storm? It might encourage someone to act." Grange's eyes narrowed, a spark of interest breaking through his scowl. "You're suggesting we rattle the cage, Miss Marple? Not a bad idea, though I don't like civilians meddling." He scratched his chin, considering. "We've got nothing solid yet. No tapestry, no clear suspect. A bit of pressure might shake something loose. But who's the witness?" "No one, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "But the guilty will fear there is one. In my experience, a guilty conscience is quick to betray itself." She paused, her eyes crinkling. "I could mention it casually, at tea perhaps, and we can watch their reactions." Grange grunted, his grudging respect evident. "All right, but I'll be watching too. If this backfires, it's on you." He turned to his constable, issuing orders to keep a close eye on the suspects that evening, particularly near the stables and the servants' passages. Miss Marple spent the day in quiet preparation, her demeanour as unassuming as ever. She joined Lady Beatrice for luncheon, where the conversation was strained, the theft a shadow over every word. Mr. Clarence was absent, claiming a headache, but Miss Evelyn served the meal with her usual nervous efficiency, her hands trembling as she poured water. Dr. Harrow ate in silence, his notebook closed, his eyes distant. Mr. Vane, ever the charmer, kept the table lively with anecdotes about art auctions, though Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flicked to the door, as if expecting interruption. As the meal ended, Miss Marple seized her moment. "Beatrice," she said, loud enough for the others to hear, "I heard the oddest thing from one of the grooms. He said he saw someone near the stables the night of the theft, despite the storm. He couldn't make out who, but he's told the inspector. Isn't that curious?" Her tone was light, almost gossipy, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the table. Evelyn's tray clattered, a glass tipping precariously before she steadied it, her face pale. Dr. Harrow's fork paused, his expression unreadable behind his spectacles. Vane's smile froze, his fingers brushing his cuff in that familiar gesture of unease. "How intriguing," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "Though in that storm, it could have been anyone, or no one." He laughed, but it rang hollow, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted to Evelyn, then away. The seed planted, Miss Marple retired to the drawing-room. Her knitting resumed as she waited for the trap to spring. She knew the guilty party might act, checking a hiding place, confronting a supposed witness, or attempting to move the tapestry again. With Inspector Grange's men watching the stables and passages, any move would be noticed. She settled by the window, her needles clicking, her mind alert to the castle's rhythms. As evening fell, the castle grew quiet, the household retiring early under the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple, however, remained vigilant, slipping into the corridor near the guest wing, with the stealth of a village spinster, accustomed to unnoticed observation. She positioned herself in a shadowed alcove, her small figure blending with the tapestries, her torch dimmed but ready. The servant's passage to the stables was nearby, and she suspected the thief might check their hiding place, spurred by her planted rumour. Her patience was rewarded near midnight, when a faint creak echoed from the passage door. A figure emerged, moving with cautious haste. Mr. Vane, his polished exterior replaced by a tense alertness. He carried a small lantern, its light casting jagged shadows as he slipped toward the stables. Miss Marple followed at a distance, her steps silent, her heart steady despite the risk. She signalled to the constable stationed nearby, who nodded and trailed behind, his boots muffled by the grass. In the stable yard, Vane approached the cellar trap door Miss Marple had discovered, lifting it with practised ease. He descended, his lantern flickering, and Miss Marple crept closer, her torch off to avoid detection. Moments later, Grange and the constable joined her, their presence a silent reassurance. Vane emerged, his face pale, clutching a folded bundle that could only be the tapestry, its crimson and gold threads glinting faintly in the lantern's glow. "Got you," Grange whispered, stepping forward with the constable. Vane froze, his eyes wide with panic, the bundle slipping from his hands. "Mr. Vane, you're under arrest for theft," Grange said, his voice hard as he signalled the constable to secure the tapestry. Vane's composure cracked, his voice rising in protest. "I was only checking it. I meant to return it. Borrowed it for study, that's all." His words were desperate, but Miss Marple's eyes were on the tapestry, now safe in the constable's hands, its intricate hunt scene undamaged but for a slight fray at one edge. As Vane was led away, Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "Ambition can blind even the cleverest, Mr. Vane. You couldn't bear to see such a treasure out of your reach." She turned to Grange, her smile serene. "The tapestry is safe, Inspector. The rest, I trust, is in your hands." Back in the castle, as the household stirred with the news, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like a metronome. The trap had worked, the thief revealed, but questions lingered. Had Vane acted alone, or was there an accomplice yet to be uncovered? The truth, she knew, was close, and her quiet observation would soon tie the final threads. Chapter 11. The Confession. The revelation of Mr. Vane's guilt sent a ripple of shock through Haverford Castle, like a stone dropped into a still pond. By mid-morning, the great hall was abuzz with hushed voices and furtive glances as the household gathered, summoned by Inspector Grange to witness the resolution of the mystery. The tapestry, retrieved from the stable cellar, lay carefully spread across a table, its crimson and gold threads catching the light, a testament to its enduring beauty despite its brief sojourn in hiding. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her usual corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, observed the scene with a quiet satisfaction, though her sharp eyes remained alert for any lingering threads of deceit. Inspector Grange stood at the centre of the room, his burly frame commanding attention, as he held up a hand for silence. Mr. Vane, his wrists bound by the constable's cuffs, stood nearby, his polished charm replaced by a sullen defiance. Lady Beatrice, pale but composed, clutched a handkerchief, her eyes darting between the tapestry and the man who had betrayed her trust. Mr. Clarence, Miss Evelyn, and Dr. Harrow were present, their faces a study in relief, suspicion and curiosity, each reacting to the morning's events in their own way. "Mr. Vane has been caught red-handed," Grange announced, his voice gruff but carrying the weight of authority. "Found with the tapestry in the stable cellar, just as Miss Marple suspected." He nodded curtly in her direction, a rare acknowledgement of her role, though his scowl suggested he resented her interference. "We'll have a full confession, Vane, or it'll go worse for you at the station." Vane's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to the tapestry as if it might speak in his defense. "I told you, I only meant to borrow it," he said, his voice strained, lacking its usual smoothness. "For study, nothing more. I'd have returned it." His words were met with a murmur of disbelief from the gathered household, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands twitched, as if longing to reclaim the prize he had lost. Miss Marple rose, her small figure drawing every eye as she approached the table, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders. "Mr. Vane," she said, her voice gentle but with a steel beneath it, "you are a man of refined tastes, but also of ambition. The tapestry was more than a study to you. It was a prize you could not bear to leave behind." She turned to the group, her eyes crinkling with a smile that belied the sharpness of her words. "Shall I explain how it came to this?" Lady Beatrice nodded, her voice soft but urgent. "Please, Jane. I want to understand how this happened under my roof." Miss Marple's needles paused, her hands resting in her lap as she began, her tone calm and deliberate, much like a village spinster recounting a local tale. "The theft of the Haverford tapestry was no impulsive act," she said. "It required knowledge of the castle's layout, its locks and its routines. Mr. Vane, you were familiar with all three. You had visited Haverford before, inquiring about the tapestry's purchase, an offer Lady Beatrice rightly refused. Your disappointment, I suspect, turned to obsession." Vane's face flushed, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "The night of the storm provided the perfect cover. You knew the Great Hall's fastenings, having studied the tapestry closely during your stay. You loosened them during dinner, a task requiring only a moment when others were distracted. Then, under cover of the storm's noise, you slipped through the servants' passage, a route you had explored, perhaps on one of your late-night walks for a glass of water." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, noting Clarence's tense posture, Evelyn's wide-eyed stillness, and Harrow's furrowed brow. "The crimson thread I found in the passage," she said, producing the handkerchief with its delicate evidence, "confirmed the tapestry's path. You carried it to the stable cellar, a temporary hiding place, intending to move it later in the cart found abandoned in the village. The green paint chip and wool fibres further traced your route. But you underestimated the castle's watchful eyes." Vane's head snapped up, his voice sharp. "You've no proof I plan to keep it. I'm a collector, not a thief. I only wanted to study it, to preserve it." His words were fervent, but Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her smile unshaken. "Preserve it for whom, Mr. Vane?" she asked softly. "For your private collection, hidden away where none could admire it. I heard of your anger when Lady Beatrice refused your offer. In my village, I knew a man much like you, a collector of rare books, who stole a manuscript he could not buy. His excuse was the same, to preserve it. But greed, not preservation, drove him as it drove you. Grange stepped forward, his notebook open. We found a letter in your room, Vane, addressed to a dealer in London, offering a unique textile for private sale. Care to explain that? Vane's defiance crumbled, his shoulders sagging. All right, he muttered, his voice low. I wanted it for my collection. It was too perfect, too rare to stay here, gathering dust in a crumbling castle. I planned to take it, sell it to a buyer who'd appreciate it. The cart was meant to get it to a contact in the village, but I panicked when the storm cleared and left it there. He looked at Lady Beatrice, his eyes pleading. I didn't mean harm. I'd have ensured it was safe. Lady Beatrice's face hardened, her voice cold. Safe? You stole a piece of my family's heart, Mr. Vane. You betrayed our hospitality. She turned away, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. Miss Marple's needles resumed their clicking, a soft counterpoint to the room's tension. Greed blinds us to others' values, she said, her voice gentle but firm. The tapestry belongs here, Mr. Vane, where it tells Haverford's story. You saw only its price, not its meaning. Grange signalled the constable to take Vane away, his voice gruff. You'll answer for this in court, Vane. And you, Miss Marple, have my thanks, though I'll not admit it often. He tipped his hat, a grudging gesture, and followed the constable out. As the room emptied, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the tapestry, now safe but bearing the faint marks of its ordeal. She thought of Evelyn's trembling hands, Clarence's nervous glances, and Harrow's secretive notes, wondering if Vane had acted alone. The confession tied many threads, but a faint doubt lingered, like a stitch left loose. Had someone else known of his plan, perhaps even aided him? The castle's secrets, she knew, were not fully unravelled. Turning to Lady Beatrice, she offered a reassuring smile. The tapestry is home, Beatrice. Let that be your comfort. But as she resumed her knitting, her mind remained alert, ready to pull the final thread if another mystery lay hidden in Haverford's shadows. Chapter 12. The Tapestry Restored. The morning sun bathed Haverford Castle in a golden glow, as if nature itself rejoiced at the return of the stolen tapestry. The great hall, once a sombre stage for suspicion and loss, now hummed with quiet triumph. The Haverford tapestry, its crimson and gold threads vibrant despite its brief misadventure, hung once more in its oak frame, meticulously resecured by Mr. Clarence under Lady Beatrice's watchful eye. The castle's staff bustled about, their relief palpable, though whispers of Mr. Vane's arrest still lingered in the corridors like echoes of the storm that had masked his crime. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the hall, her small figure almost lost in the grandeur of the room, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. Her spectacles caught the light as she studied the tapestry, its medieval hunt scene as vivid as ever, though a faint fray at one edge bore witness to its ordeal. Her needles remained still, a rare pause as she reflected on the resolution of the mystery and the human frailties that had unravelled it. Lady Beatrice approached, her face softened by gratitude, though a shadow of strain remained in her eyes. "Jane, you've saved us," Beatrice said, her voice warm but tremulous. "The tapestry is back where it belongs, and that dreadful man is in custody." I don't know how you saw through his charm." She gestured to the tapestry, her hand lingering as if to reassure herself of its presence. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with modesty. "People are much like tapestries, Beatrice," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Their flaws and desires are woven into their actions, if you know where to look." Mr. Vane's ambition was his undoing, a thread too bright to miss. She adjusted her shawl, her gaze drifting to the gathered household. Mr. Clarence, his nervous demeanour softened by the tapestry's return, was polishing the frame's brass fastenings, his movements precise but less frantic than before. Miss Evelyn, arranging flowers near the hearth, seemed lighter, though her hands still twitched occasionally, a remnant of her earlier fears. Dr. Harrow stood apart, his notebook open, scribbling notes as if the theft were now a mere academic curiosity. Their presence, Miss Marple noted, was a reminder that the castle's peace was fragile, restored but not without scars. Inspector Grange, lingering near the door, approached with a grudging nod. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with respect. "I'd not have thought to set that trap without your nudge." The tapestry's back, and Vane's off to face justice. "We found papers in his room, letters to a dealer confirming his plan to sell it abroad." He shook his head, his scowl returning. "Still, I don't like civilians outsmarting my men." Miss Marple's smile was serene. "I only observe, Inspector." The truth has a way of revealing itself, given time and a little prompting. Her words were humble, but her eyes held a glint of satisfaction, like a village spinster who had solved a puzzle others overlooked. As Grange departed to finalize his report, Miss Marple turned her attention to the others, her mind lingering on the loose threads of the case. Vane's confession had tied the crime to his ambition, but she wondered if he had acted entirely alone. Evelyn's nervousness, Clarence's guarded glances, and Harrow's secretive notes had suggested other currents beneath the surface, though none had solidified into complicity. The crimson threads, the paint chip, the wool fibres, and the abandoned cart had all pointed to Vane, but human nature, she knew, was rarely so tidy. In St. Mary Mead, a theft had once revealed a web of minor accomplices, each driven by their own small motives. Here she sensed no such web, but her instincts urged caution. She approached Evelyn, who was adjusting a vase with undue care. "You must be relieved, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice kind. "The tapestry's return lifts a weight from us all. You've been so brave through this ordeal." Her eyes were gentle, but they watched closely, noting the girl's slight flinch. "I'm glad it's back," Evelyn said, her voice soft, her hands steadying the vase. "It didn't feel right. The hall's so empty." Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, then dropped, and Miss Marple sensed no guilt, only the lingering fear of a young woman caught in a storm of suspicion. Satisfied, Miss Marple moved to Clarence, who was stepping back to admire his work. "A fine job, Mr. Clarence," she said, her tone warm. "The tapestry looks as if it never left. You must feel proud to see it restored." Her words were encouraging, but her gaze noted his fleeting glance toward the servants' passage. A habit born of nerves rather than guilt, she decided. "It's my duty," Clarence said, his voice steadier now. "I failed to protect it once, but I'll not let it happen again." His sincerity was clear, and Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions of him easing into the background. Dr. Harrow, closing his notebook, offered a thin smile as she approached. "A remarkable resolution, Miss Marple," he said, his voice dry. "Your insight rivals a scholar's. I suppose I'll return to my manuscripts now, with less distraction." His detachment was genuine, and Miss Marple dismissed her earlier doubts about his secretive calls, attributing them to academic pursuits rather than criminal ones. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple joined Lady Beatrice for a final tea in the drawing-room, the atmosphere lighter but still tinged with the memory of betrayal. "Jane," Beatrice said, pouring tea with a steadier hand, "you've given me back more than the tapestry. You've restored my faith in this place. Will you stay a little longer?" Miss Marple shook her head, her smile gentle. "I must return to Saint." "Mary Mead, Beatrice, my garden needs tending, and my nephew will be wondering where I've got to. But I'm glad the tapestry is home." She sipped her tea, her mind already turning to the train journey ahead. Later, as she packed her knitting bag, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Vane's greed had been the driving force, his plan thwarted by her subtle trap and the castle's watchful eyes. The threads of evidence, crimson, green, and woolen, had woven a clear path to his guilt. But it was his human weakness, his inability to resist the lure of possession, that had betrayed him. The others, she concluded, were innocent, their nerves and secrets mere shadows of the larger crime. As she boarded the train to St. Mary Mead, her needles resumed their familiar clicking, a soothing rhythm against the clatter of the rails. Haverford's mystery was solved, its tapestry restored, but Miss Marple knew that human nature, with its endless patterns of desire and deceit, would always offer new puzzles. For now she was content, her sharp mind already anticipating the quiet scandals of her village, where secrets like threads waited to be unravelled.